October 24th, 1944. 10:30 in the morning. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the flag bridge of the battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built, watching the horizon through his binoculars. His intelligence briefing had been clear. 4 American carriers, maybe 5. Manageable numbers. Then the first wave of American aircraft appeared, then the second, then the third. By afternoon, Kurita had counted over 250 aircraft sorties against his fleet. His flagship's sister ship, the mighty Musashi, absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before capsizing. When the smoke cleared, Japanese reconnaissance confirmed the impossible. Not 4 carriers. Not 5. 17 Essex-class carriers had appeared at Leyte Gulf. The intelligence estimate was wrong by 340%. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. 3 years earlier, a 59-year-old civilian who had never built a warship in his life proposed an idea so insane that naval engineers laughed in his face. They said aircraft carriers required 4 years of precision craftsmanship. He said he could build them in 14 months. They said warships demanded master welders with decades of experience. He hired housewives and taught them to weld in 6 weeks. His name was Henry Kaiser, and his ridiculous methods would produce more aircraft carriers than Japan's entire navy could handle. The year was 1942. America was losing the Pacific War. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the Pacific Fleet. Within 6 months, Japan had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and dozens of Pacific islands. Japanese carriers ruled the ocean. Their pilots were the best in the world. Their Zero fighters outclassed anything America could put in the sky. At Midway in June 1942, America achieved a miraculous victory by sinking 4 Japanese carriers. But the cost was brutal. The USS Yorktown went down. The air groups suffered devastating losses. More critically, America's remaining carrier strength in the Pacific consisted of just 3 vessels: Enterprise, Saratoga, and the newly arrived Hornet. 3 carriers against the entire Japanese empire. The mathematics were terrifying. Japanese intelligence officers calculated American carrier production capacity with cold precision. An Essex-class carrier displaced 27,000 tons. It required 15,000 tons of specialized steel. It needed propulsion machinery, generating 150,000 shaft horsepower. It carried 90 aircraft, which meant extensive hangar facilities, aviation fuel storage, ordnance magazines, and maintenance workshops. Based on Japan's own experience building the carrier Taiho, such a ship required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. American shipyards might build faster, but not dramatically faster. The fundamental constraints of warship construction applied to everyone. Steel could only be shaped so quickly. Skilled welders could only work so many hours. Complex systems required careful installation and testing. Japanese strategists concluded that America might commission 8 to 10 fleet carriers by mid-1944. A formidable force, but spread across 2 oceans: Atlantic convoy protection, European theater operations, Pacific deployments. No single battle would face more than 4 or 5 American carriers. That assumption was built on a catastrophic misunderstanding of one man's vision. Henry John Kaiser was born in 1882 in upstate New York. He never graduated from high school. He started his career as a photographer's apprentice, then moved into construction building roads in Cuba highways in California, and eventually massive infrastructure projects, including the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam. By 1940, Kaiser had earned a reputation as a man who delivered impossible projects ahead of schedule and under budget, but he had never built a ship. When the war began, the U.S. Maritime Commission faced a crisis. German U-boats were sinking cargo ships faster than traditional shipyards could replace them. The commission needed someone willing to think differently. Kaiser walked into their offices with a proposal that made experienced shipbuilders choke on their coffee. He would build cargo ships using assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Instead of constructing vessels from the keel up one frame at a time, he would prefabricate major sections in specialized facilities, then assemble them at the shipyard like giant building blocks. The maritime establishment was skeptical. Ships were not automobiles. They required precision fitting. They demanded experienced craftsmen who understood the thousand subtle ways a vessel must resist the sea. Kaiser listened politely, then built a shipyard from scratch in Richmond, California, and started proving everyone wrong. His first Liberty ship took 244 days to build, then 60 days, then 30 days. In November 1942, his workers assembled the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. It was a publicity stunt, but it proved a point. The impossible was simply a problem no one had solved yet. Kaiser looked at aircraft carrier construction the same way he looked at cargo ships. Everyone said carriers required 4 years of meticulous work. Kaiser asked why. The answers always came back to the same themes: complexity, precision, skilled labor shortages. Kaiser systematically attacked each constraint. Traditional shipbuilding constructed vessels sequentially: lay the keel, build the frames, install the plating, add the systems. Each step waited for the previous step to complete. Kaiser's method built components simultaneously in different locations. While one team fabricated hull sections, another assembled propulsion modules, another built internal compartments, another prepared electrical systems. When all components were ready, they converged at the shipway for rapid final assembly. The technique required massive coordination, detailed planning, and standardization that made naval architects uncomfortable. But it worked. More controversially, Kaiser replaced riveting with welding wherever possible. Traditional shipbuilders viewed riveting as the proven method. Riveted joints were understood. Their failure modes were predictable. Welding was newer, less tested, and required skills that took years to develop. Kaiser's response was characteristically direct. He opened welding schools that trained workers in 6 weeks instead of 6 years. He simplified techniques so that women, minorities, and workers with no industrial background could perform tasks previously reserved for master craftsmen. Experienced naval constructors watched Kaiser's methods with horror. They predicted his ships would crack, leak, and fall apart under combat stress. Some Liberty ships did develop cracking problems in cold water. Kaiser's teams studied the failures, redesigned the affected areas, and continued production without slowing down. When Kaiser proposed applying his methods to aircraft carrier construction, the Navy's Bureau of Ships raised every objection imaginable. Carriers were not cargo ships. They required sophisticated aviation facilities, ammunition handling systems, and damage control arrangements that could not be simplified. Kaiser acknowledged the complexity, then asked a simple question. Why not try the first experimental application of Kaiser's prefabrication techniques to carrier construction began at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia in late 1942. Newport News was the primary builder of Essex-class carriers vessels that represented the cutting edge of American naval aviation. The yard's experienced workforce was skeptical of changes imposed by a civilian outsider. But the pressure from Washington was intense. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, had made carrier production his top priority. Every month without new carriers meant more sailors dying in the Pacific. Newport News adapted Kaiser's methods carefully at first. Hull sections were prefabricated in specialized assembly buildings, then moved to the shipway for integration. The technique reduced time workers spent in confined shipboard spaces, improving both safety and efficiency. More importantly, it allowed parallel construction. While one carrier's hull was being assembled on the shipway, components for the next carrier were already being fabricated in the assembly buildings. The results exceeded expectations. USS Yorktown, the second Essex-class carrier, was laid down in December 1941 and commissioned in April 1943, 16 months from keel to completion. USS Hornet laid down in August 1942, commissioned in November 1943. 15 months. USS Franklin laid down in December 1942, commissioned in January 1944. 13 months. The construction timeline was shrinking with every ship. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American shipyard activity through various sources knew something unusual was happening. Reconnaissance photographs showed increasing numbers of large carriers at American naval bases. Radio intercepts revealed unfamiliar call signs in fleet communications. Prisoner interrogations provided testimonies from sailors serving on carriers that did not appear in Japanese databases. But the significance of these fragments was not understood. Each piece of information was evaluated individually rather than synthesized into comprehensive assessment. By June 1944, the transformation of American carrier production had reached maturity. 5 shipyards were building Essex-class carriers simultaneously. Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Bethlehem Steel's Four River Shipyard. Each yard had adapted prefabrication techniques to its specific facilities. Each was commissioning carriers at rates that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the first major test. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 Japanese carriers against what his intelligence estimated was an American force of 11 or 12 carriers. The actual American force consisted of 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, and 8 Independence-class light carriers, embarking 956 aircraft. The battle was a massacre. American fighters intercepted Japanese strike waves 60 miles from the carriers and destroyed them. Of 450 Japanese aircraft launched, 300 were shot down. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. The exchange ratio was 10-1. Japanese after-action reports noted that American carrier strength exceeded pre-battle estimates by 3 carriers. The technological gap was wider than assumed. Recommendations for strategic reassessment were filed, but the full scope of American carrier production remained hidden behind institutional assumptions that refused to die. The mathematics that would destroy Japanese naval power were already written in American shipyard production records. Newport News alone had commissioned 6 Essex-class carriers by October 1944, with 3 more under construction. Brooklyn Navy Yard had contributed 4 more. The other yards added their own output. Total Essex-class carriers operational by the Battle of Leyte Gulf 17. Japanese pre-war estimates had projected American Pacific carrier strength would reach 8 to 10 carriers by mid-1944. The actual number was 260% higher. When Vice Admiral Kurita's force emerged from San Bernardino Strait on October 25, 1944, he faced not the 4 or 5 carriers his intelligence briefing had promised, but overwhelming air power from multiple task groups operating in coordinated strikes. His battleships maneuvered desperately under continuous air attack. His cruisers were torpedoed and bombed. His mission to destroy the American invasion fleet became a desperate retreat. The mockery had ended. The fear had begun. But this was only the beginning. In Part 2, we will see how Japanese intelligence officers finally discovered the terrifying truth about American carrier production, why they classified that information above top secret, and how the decision to suppress the truth cost thousands of Japanese lives in battles that senior leadership knew could not be won. The 17 carriers at Leyte Gulf were not the end of American production. They were barely the beginning. In Part 1, we watched Henry Kaiser transform aircraft carrier construction from a 4-year craftsmanship project into a 14-month assembly line miracle. His prefabrication methods produced 17 Essex-class carriers by October 1944, 3 times more than Japanese intelligence believed possible. At Leyte Gulf, Vice Admiral Kurita discovered the catastrophic truth when 250 aircraft sorties overwhelmed his fleet in a single afternoon. But building carriers was only half the battle. The other half was fought in conference rooms in Tokyo, where Japanese intelligence officers faced a choice that would cost thousands of lives. They had discovered the truth about American industrial capacity. And what they did with that truth reveals the darkest chapter of institutional failure in military history. Because knowing the enemy's strength means nothing if your leaders refuse to believe you. Captain Toshikazu Ohmae had been warning the combined fleet staff about American carrier production since August 1942. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, his reconnaissance reports showed more American carriers than official estimates predicted. Radio intercepts referenced task group designations that did not match known deployments. Either Americans were moving carriers between theaters faster than seemed possible, or Japanese intelligence had fundamentally miscounted enemy strength. Ohmae requested updated assessments. The reports confirmed 4 Essex-class carriers under construction: Lexington, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, all named after carriers lost earlier in the war. The Americans were replacing losses faster than Japanese calculations suggested should be possible. Ohmae drafted a memorandum for the Naval General Staff. American carrier construction appeared to be proceeding faster than pre-war estimates projected. If the trend continued, American carrier strength would grow faster than Japanese forces could counter through attrition. The memorandum was read. It was filed. It was dismissed. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the Operations Bureau, summoned Ohmae to his office in November 1942. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. Fukudome sat behind his desk, Ohmae's memorandum lying unopened before him. "Captain, I have read your concerns about American carrier production." Fukudome's voice was cold. "Your analysis contradicts every assessment from our technical bureaus. Our engineers have studied American shipyard capacity. They understand the constraints of carrier construction. You are suggesting the Americans have somehow violated the laws of physics." Ohmae stood at attention. "Sir, I am suggesting our estimates may be incomplete. The evidence from Guadalcanal indicates more carriers than we have accounted for. The evidence from Guadalcanal indicates the Americans are moving their limited carriers more aggressively than we anticipated. It does not indicate they have manufactured additional carriers from thin air." Fukudome pushed the memorandum across his desk. "I am rejecting this assessment. You will not circulate these concerns further. Operational planning depends on reliable intelligence, not speculation that contradicts expert analysis. Do you understand?" Ohmae understood perfectly. His career would end if he persisted. The institutional culture of Japanese naval intelligence prioritized supporting operational plans over challenging strategic assumptions. Officers who raised concerns about growing American strength were dismissed as overly cautious or insufficiently confident in Japanese capabilities. The organizational incentive structure rewarded optimistic assessments that supported aggressive operations. Pessimistic assessments that suggested caution were career suicide. But Ohmae was not the only officer watching American shipyards with growing alarm. Commander Chikataka Nakajima served in the intelligence division of the Naval General Staff. Unlike Ohmae, who analyzed operational deployments, Nakajima specialized in industrial intelligence. He tracked steel production figures, shipyard expansion, labor force statistics. The numbers told a story that terrified him. In January 1943, Nakajima obtained a copy of the American Congressional Record containing naval appropriations for fiscal year 1943. The document was not classified. It was publicly available in the United States. The Americans made no attempt to hide their shipbuilding program. They publicized it as evidence of industrial might and determination to win the war. The appropriations authorized construction of Essex-class carriers through hull number CV-21. Nakajima counted existing carriers and carriers under construction. The numbers suggested 17 to 20 Essex-class carriers would enter service by late 1944. 20 fleet carriers. Japan had commissioned 3 fleet carriers since the war began. The ratio was approaching 7 to 1. Nakajima brought his analysis to Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, head of the operations section. Tomioka listened carefully, then asked a question that revealed everything about Japanese strategic thinking. "Commander, even if the Americans build 20 carriers, how many can they concentrate in one theater? They have commitments in the Atlantic. They must support MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific. They must protect their Central Pacific advance. No single battle will face more than 5 or 6 American carriers. Our doctrine can handle 5 or 6 carriers." Nakajima tried to explain that American carrier production was not just about numbers. It was about depth. The Americans could lose carriers and replace them faster than Japan could inflict casualties. They could sustain operations indefinitely, while Japanese strength declined with every engagement. Tomioka nodded politely and filed the report. The assumption that American carriers would remain dispersed became doctrine. Japanese operational planning from mid-1943 onward was built on this foundation. Any specific battle would involve manageable numbers of enemy carriers. The assumption was catastrophically wrong. But challenging it required admitting that pre-war planning had been based on flawed understanding of American industrial capacity. That admission was politically impossible. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided undeniable evidence that Japanese assumptions were wrong. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers against what intelligence estimated was 11 or 12 American carriers. The actual American force consisted of 15 carriers embarking 956 aircraft. The battle was a slaughter. Of 450 Japanese aircraft launched, 300 were shot down. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. Ozawa's after-action report was explicit. American carrier strength exceeded pre-battle estimates by 3 carriers. American fighter direction capabilities and aircraft performance were superior to anything intelligence had predicted. The technological gap was wider than assumed. The report recommended immediate reassessment of American carrier production capabilities. This time, the recommendation was accepted. In July 1944, a working group of experienced intelligence officers and technical specialists was assembled to determine actual American carrier strength. They were given access to every available source: reconnaissance photographs, radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, captured documents, technical publications, analyses from German naval intelligence shared through military attaches. The investigation took 6 weeks. The working group compiled construction data on every Essex-class carrier from all available sources: ship names, hull numbers, keel laying dates, launch dates, commissioning dates. The patterns that emerged were devastating. USS Essex had taken 20 months from keel to commissioning. USS Yorktown took 16 months. USS Hornet took 15 months. USS Franklin took 13 months. The construction timeline was shrinking with every ship. Americans had refined their techniques and were building carriers progressively faster. More critically, 5 American shipyards were building Essex-class carriers simultaneously: Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Bethlehem Steel's Fore River Shipyard. Japan had 1 shipyard capable of building fleet carriers. The mathematical implications were absolute. If 5 American shipyards each completed 1 carrier every 15 months, total production was 1 carrier every 3 months. 4 carriers per year minimum. At that rate, American carrier strength would grow indefinitely, while Japanese strength declined toward 0. The working group's preliminary findings reached Combined Fleet Headquarters in August 1944. 17 Essex-class fleet carriers operational. 9 Independence-class light carriers operational. Total, 26 fleet and light carriers, not counting escort carriers. 26 carriers. Japanese pre-war estimates had projected 8 to 10 carriers by mid-1944. The actual number was 260% higher. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, convened a special briefing to review the findings. The senior officers present included the Navy Minister, the Chief of Naval General Staff, and 5 staff officers directly involved in strategic planning. 8 men in total. The briefing officer presented the evidence systematically. Reconnaissance photographs showing carrier concentrations at Pearl Harbor, Ulithi, and other American bases. Radio intercepts confirming carrier call signs that did not appear in existing databases. Prisoner testimonies describing ships by name. Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, Bennington, Boxer. The names kept coming. The room was silent when the briefing concluded. Admiral Toyota spoke first. What is your projection for American carrier strength by the end of 1944? The briefing officer consulted his notes. Based on observed construction rates, we project 24 Essex-class fleet carriers operational by December, 9 Independence-class light carriers, over 100 escort carriers, total carrier inventory exceeding 130 vessels. 130 carriers. Japan had 4 carriers operational after Philippine Sea losses. The ratio was 32-1. And by mid-1945, if current production rates continue, 24 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, and approximately 150 escort carriers, total approaching 200 vessels. The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Japan could not win a carrier war against an opponent with 50 times more carriers and growing industrial capacity, showing no signs of slowing. The mathematical reality was absolute, but acknowledging that reality publicly would mean admitting the war was lost. It would mean admitting senior leadership had led Japan into an unwinnable conflict. It would mean military and political consequences no one in authority wanted to face. Admiral Toyota made the decision that would cost thousands of lives. This assessment will be classified above top secret. Distribution is restricted to the personnel in this room. No copies will be made. No summaries will be distributed. No briefings will be conducted for field commanders. Operational planning will continue based on existing estimates. Commander Nakajima, who had been warning about American industrial capacity for 2 years, was not present at the briefing. Captain Ome, whose memorandum had been rejected in 1942, was not informed of the findings. The officers who had been right were kept in the dark. The officers who had been wrong continued making decisions. Vice Admiral Kurita received his intelligence briefing before the Leyte Gulf operation in October 1944. American carrier strength in Philippine waters. 4 to 5 fleet carriers organized in 2 task groups. Strong opposition, but manageable if Japanese forces coordinated effectively. The briefing was based on estimates that senior leadership knew were wrong by a factor of 3 to 4. Kurita was not told about the July reassessment. He was not informed that American carrier strength exceeded 90 vessels. He was sent into battle with intelligence that had been proven catastrophically false 3 months earlier. When American aircraft swarmed his fleet on October 24th, Kurita requested clarification from Combined Fleet Headquarters. How many American carriers were operating in Philippine waters? The response came back late in the afternoon. Intelligence estimates remained unchanged. 4 to 5 fleet carriers, possibly reinforced by 1 or 2 light carriers. The officers who sent that response knew it was wrong. They had seen the July assessment. They understood American carrier strength was 3 times higher than the estimate they were providing. They sent the false intelligence anyway because acknowledging the truth would require explaining why field commanders had not been informed earlier. The institutional cover-up had created a feedback loop of deception. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed 13 large carriers east of the Philippines that evening, Kurita finally understood the scale of the intelligence failure. Not 4 carriers, not 5. 13 fleet carriers in the immediate operational area with more operating elsewhere. The implications were staggering. His mission to destroy the American invasion fleet was impossible. His battleships would be annihilated long before they reached Leyte Gulf. Kurita requested permission to withdraw. The response from headquarters was unambiguous. Continue the mission. Continue the... The human cost of institutional denial was measured in the weeks and months that followed. Carrier pilots were sent on missions against American task forces, where they faced 10-to-1 odds and rarely returned. Surface forces were ordered to attack targets protected by carrier air power that destroyed them before they closed to effective range. Submarines were dispatched to areas saturated with American anti-submarine forces and never heard from again. Every operation from late 1944 onward was executed with senior leadership knowing privately that American carrier superiority made success impossible. Operations continued because stopping would require explaining why. Explaining why would require admitting the war had been lost before it truly began. The intelligence assessment that could have changed Japanese strategy remained locked in classified files seen by only 8 officers, while thousands of men died in battles that headquarters knew could not be won. Vice Admiral Kurita survived Leyte Gulf and returned to Japan in November 1944. He submitted a detailed after-action report estimating American carrier strength at 15 or more vessels based on observed aircraft sortie rates. His estimate was conservative, but closer to reality than any previous official assessment. The report was read by staff officers who already knew from the July assessment that American strength exceeded Kurita's estimate substantially. Kurita was thanked for his service and reassigned to administrative duties. He was given no further operational commands. He was never told about the July assessment. He was never informed that headquarters had known the truth and sent him into battle anyway. But the secret could not remain buried forever. In December 1944, the working group completed its final comprehensive report on American naval strength. The conclusions were unsparing. American carrier construction had proceeded at rates. Japanese intelligence failed to anticipate or detect until operational encounters forced recognition. American total carrier inventory exceeded 90 vessels, with production continuing at sustained high rates. Japan could not match counter or offset this level of industrial output through any feasible combination of tactical innovation, strategic adjustment, or enhanced production. The American advantage was absolute and growing. The report recommended immediate strategic reassessment at the highest levels of government. Continuing the war against an opponent with overwhelming and expanding naval superiority served no rational purpose and guaranteed eventual complete defeat. The recommendation was ignored. The war continued. But the truth about American carrier production had begun leaking beyond the 8 officers who had seen the July briefing. Junior staff officers noticed discrepancies between official estimates and operational reports. Pilots returning from missions described aircraft concentrations that made no sense, given reported enemy strength. Rumors spread through the fleet that American carriers were appearing faster than anyone could explain. In Part 3, we will see what happened when the truth could no longer be contained. How Japanese pilots developed the kamikaze as a desperate response to overwhelming carrier superiority. How American carriers became so numerous that they could absorb suicide attacks and still expand operations. And how the final months of the war revealed the full, terrifying scope of American industrial power. 17 carriers at Leyte Gulf was just the beginning. By war's end, the Americans would commission 151 carriers. The ratio would reach 17-to-1. And the institutional failure that kept Japanese commanders fighting impossible battles would claim tens of thousands more lives before the end finally came. In Part 1, Henry Kaiser transformed aircraft carrier construction from a 4-year craftsmanship project into a 14-month assembly line miracle. In Part 2, we watched Japanese intelligence discover the catastrophic truth about American industrial capacity and bury that truth in classified files while sending thousands of men to die in battles headquarters knew could not be won. 17 Essex-class carriers appeared at Leyte Gulf. Japanese intelligence had estimated 4. The error was 340%. But the story does not end with intelligence failure. When Japanese pilots returned from Leyte Gulf, describing American aircraft appearing in numbers that exceeded entire Japanese air groups when survivors spoke of wave after wave of attacks that never stopped. When the mathematics of carrier warfare became undeniable, Japan's military leadership faced a choice: adapt or die. They chose a third option, a response so desperate, so horrifying, that it would define the final year of the Pacific War. The kamikaze was born from the ashes of Leyte Gulf, and American carriers would face their greatest test yet. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived in the Philippines on October 17, 1944, 1 week before Kurita's fleet encountered 17 American carriers. Onishi commanded the First Air Fleet responsible for land-based naval aviation in the Philippines. His orders were to support the Leyte Gulf operation by attacking American carriers. The problem was simple mathematics. Onishi had approximately 100 operational aircraft. American carriers in Philippine waters embarked over 1,000 aircraft. His pilots were mostly inexperienced replacements. American pilots had years of combat training. His aircraft were aging Zeros and outdated bombers. American aircraft were modern Hellcats and Avengers with superior performance in every category. Conventional attacks against American task forces had proven suicidal. At Philippine Sea 4 months earlier, 300 Japanese aircraft attacked 15 American carriers. American fighters shot down 243 of them. The exchange ratio was 10-1. Onishi calculated his options. If his 100 aircraft attacked conventionally, perhaps 10 would survive long enough to release weapons. Of those, perhaps 2 or 3 might score hits. The damage would be negligible against a force of 17 carriers. But what if the aircraft themselves became the weapons? What if pilots did not need to survive the attack? What if every aircraft that reached the target guaranteed a hit? Onishi summoned his senior officers on October 19th. His proposal was stark. Form special attack units. Volunteers only. One-way missions. Aircraft loaded with explosives would dive directly into American carriers. No evasion, no escape, no survival. The pilots would die. But they would take American ships with them. The first kamikaze unit was formed that night. 24 volunteers. The next morning they began training for missions they would not survive. The first organized kamikaze attack struck American escort carriers off Leyte Gulf on October 25, 1944. The same day, Kurita's battleships encountered Taffy 3. 5 Zeros carrying 250-kilogram bombs dove on the escort carrier group. One struck USS Santee, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar. Another hit USS Sewanee, killing 71 crew members. A third crashed into USS St. Lo. The bomb detonated among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. St. Lo sank in 30 minutes, taking 143 men with her. 3 hits from 5 aircraft. 60% success rate. Conventional attacks achieved perhaps 5% hit rates against defended targets. The kamikaze had multiplied effectiveness by a factor of 12. Japanese naval leadership recognized the implications immediately. If one-way attacks could achieve 60% hit rates, Japan's remaining aircraft could inflict massive damage on American carriers despite overwhelming numerical inferiority. The mathematics that had doomed conventional operations suddenly seemed less absolute. Vice Admiral Onishi expanded the kamikaze program rapidly. By November, hundreds of pilots had volunteered. By December, thousands. The aircraft were modified for maximum damage. Some carried 500-kilogram bombs. Others were loaded with additional fuel to increase the fireball on impact. Pilots received minimal training because they only needed to fly once. The American response was initially confusion. Intelligence officers struggled to understand why Japanese pilots were not attempting to escape after attacking. Surely this was desperation, not doctrine. Surely Japan could not sustain operations that consumed pilots faster than any training program could replace them. The Americans underestimated Japanese determination. They also underestimated how thoroughly Leyte Gulf had convinced Japanese leadership that conventional tactics were hopeless. But the kamikaze faced a problem that no amount of pilot sacrifice could overcome. The problem was Henry Kaiser's production lines. American carriers were being damaged by kamikaze attacks. USS Franklin, USS Intrepid, USS Bunker Hill, USS Enterprise. Each ship absorbed hits that killed dozens or hundreds of crew members. Each ship limped back to rear areas for repairs. But the damaged carriers were replaced immediately by fresh vessels arriving from American shipyards. USS Randolph commissioned in October 1944, USS Bonhomme Richard in November, USS Boxer in April 1945, USS Antietam in January 1945. The pipeline of new carriers never stopped. For every carrier damaged by kamikaze attack, another carrier arrived to take its place. The exchange rate that had seemed favorable in October became catastrophic by December. Japan was trading trained pilots for temporary carrier damage that American industry repaired within weeks. Pilots took months to train. Carriers took months to build. But America was building carriers faster than Japan was producing pilots. The mathematics remained absolute. Japanese leadership recognized this reality but saw no alternative. Conventional attacks achieved nothing. Surrender was unthinkable. The kamikaze continued because stopping would require admitting the war was lost. Internal crisis erupted in February 1945 when American carriers struck Tokyo directly. Over 120 aircraft from Task Force 58 attacked the Japanese capital. The first carrier raid on Tokyo since Doolittle in April 1942. But Doolittle had launched 16 bombers from one carrier in a desperate propaganda mission. This raid launched 120 aircraft from multiple carriers conducting routine operations. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese civilians saw American carrier aircraft over their capital. The same carriers that propaganda had mocked as inferior American copies were now striking Japan's heartland with impunity. Criticism of the kamikaze program intensified. Army generals questioned why Navy pilots were dying in attacks that failed to stop American advances. Navy admirals blamed inadequate Army air support. Politicians demanded explanations for why American carriers operated freely off Japanese coasts, despite thousands of kamikaze sorties. No one could provide satisfactory answers because no answers existed. The fundamental problem was industrial capacity, and industrial capacity could not be changed by pilot sacrifice. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945. It would become the largest and bloodiest naval campaign of the Pacific War. American forces landed 180,000 troops on an island 340 miles from the Japanese home islands. The invasion force was supported by the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. Task Force 58 provided carrier air support. 17 fast carriers. Over 200 aircraft. The carriers would maintain continuous operations for 3 months, flying combat air patrol, close air support, and strikes against Japanese air bases in southern Japan. Japanese leadership recognized Okinawa as the final opportunity to inflict damage severe enough to affect American invasion plans for the home islands. They committed everything. Over 1,900 kamikaze aircraft. 5,000 conventional aircraft. The super battleship Yamato on a one-way mission to beach herself at Okinawa and fight as a fixed battery until destroyed. The aerial assault began on April 6th. Operation Kikusui. Floating Chrysanthemum. 355 kamikaze aircraft attacked American naval forces in a single day. The attacks continued for weeks, wave after wave. April 6th, April 12th, April 16th, May 4th, May 11th, May 24th, June 21st. Each mass attack threw hundreds of aircraft at American ships. The damage was horrific. USS Leyte. Hit April 6th. 7 dead. USS Newcomb. Hit April 6th. 40 dead. USS Bush, hit April 6th, sank, 94 dead. USS Colquhoun, hit April 6th, sank, 35 dead. USS Manart El Abel, hit April 12th, sank, 79 dead. The destroyers on radar picket duty absorbed the worst attacks. They were the first ships kamikaze pilots encountered. They died by the dozens defending the carriers they protected. April 16th, USS Pringle sank, 65 dead. USS Laffey survived 22 separate kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes. Hit by 6 aircraft. Hit by 4 bombs. 32 dead. 71 wounded. The ship refused to sink. May 11th brought the most devastating single kamikaze hit of the war. USS Bunker Hill Admiral Mark Mitcher's flagship was struck by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the ready room. The second hit the base of the island structure. Aviation fuel ignited. Ammunition cooked off. The ship became an inferno. 393 men died. 264 were wounded. Bunker Hill survived but was out of the war. Mitcher transferred his flag to Enterprise. 3 days later, Enterprise was hit. Mitcher transferred again to Randolph. The carriers kept operating. Damaged ships withdrew. Fresh ships arrived. The production lines in Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania continued launching new vessels. USS Lake Champlain commissioned in June 1945. USS Tarawa in December. The pipeline never stopped. The statistics from Okinawa revealed both the effectiveness and the futility of the kamikaze campaign. Japanese aircraft flew over 1,900 kamikaze sorties during the battle. American ships suffered 368 kamikaze hits and near misses. 36 ships were sunk. 368 were damaged. 4 907 American sailors were killed. 4 824 were wounded. The human cost was staggering. But the strategic impact was negligible. Not a single fast carrier was sunk. American carrier operations continued without interruption throughout the 3-month battle. The invasion succeeded. Okinawa fell. Japanese forces lost approximately 110,000 dead. The exchange ratio measured in strategic terms remained overwhelmingly favorable to America, despite the kamikaze. For every American ship sunk, Japan lost approximately 53 aircraft and pilots. Ships could be replaced faster than pilots could be trained. The mathematics remained absolute. American carrier strength at the end of Okinawa exceeded American carrier strength at the beginning. Damaged ships had been replaced. New ships had arrived. The production advantage that Japanese intelligence had identified in July 1944 and buried in classified files had become undeniable reality. Task Force 58 ended the Okinawa campaign with more striking power than it began with. Japan's kamikaze forces were exhausted. Most experienced pilots were dead. Aircraft reserves were depleted. The desperate gamble had failed not because it lacked courage or determination, but because industrial capacity trumped tactical innovation every time. Henry Kaiser's assembly lines had defeated Japan's samurai spirit. The impact extended far beyond Okinawa. By July 1945, American carrier task forces ranged freely along the Japanese coast. Japanese air defenses were exhausted. The few remaining aircraft were held back for final homeland defense operations. American carriers launched over 2,000 sorties per day during July operations. They struck airfields, factories, railroads, harbors. They attacked the remnants of the Japanese fleet at anchor. On July 24th, carrier aircraft sank the battleship Hyuga. On July 28th, they sank the carrier Amagi and the battleship Haruna. The Japanese surface fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force. American carriers operated with complete impunity within sight of Japanese shores. The same Essex-class carriers that Japanese admirals had mocked in 1942 as mass-produced inferior copies were now destroying Japan from waters that should have been defended by Japanese naval power. The final accounting was stark. Japan commissioned 9 carriers during the war. America commissioned 151 carriers, 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, 118 escort carriers. The ratio was nearly 17-1. The kamikaze had killed thousands of American sailors. They had damaged dozens of ships. They had demonstrated courage that impressed even their enemies, but they had not changed the mathematics. American industrial capacity had made attrition irrelevant. Japan could not sink carriers faster than Kaiser could build them. The war ended in August 1945. The carrier task forces that had fought from Leyte Gulf to Okinawa were anchored in Tokyo Bay when Japan surrendered. Enterprise was there. Yorktown was there. Randolph and Shangri-La and Wasp and Bennington. The fleet that Japanese intelligence had estimated at 4 or 5 carriers in October 1944 had grown to overwhelming strength. The mockery had ended at Leyte Gulf. The fear had consumed the final year of the war. The mathematics had been absolute from the beginning. But this story has one chapter remaining. What happened to the men who built the carriers that won the Pacific War? What happened to Henry Kaiser after the war ended? What happened to the intelligence officers who tried to warn Japanese leadership and were ignored? What happened to Vice Admiral Kurita, who survived Leyte Gulf, knowing the truth about American carrier strength that his own headquarters had hidden from him? The carriers themselves have their own legacy. Essex served until 1969. Yorktown became a museum ship. Intrepid sits in New York Harbor today, visited by millions who walk her decks without knowing the story of how she was built in 15 months by workers who had never seen a warship before the war began. In Part 4, we will explore the aftermath. The fates of the men who made history. The lessons that military planners learned and forgot and learned again. And the final devastating truth about why Japanese admirals mocked Essex carriers until 17 of them appeared at Leyte Gulf. It was not intelligence failure. It was not industrial miscalculation. It was something far more fundamental. A failure of imagination that cost Japan everything it fought to preserve. The story is not over. The most important lesson comes last. In Part 1, Henry Kaiser proposed building aircraft carriers using assembly line techniques that naval engineers called impossible. In Part 2, Japanese intelligence discovered the catastrophic truth about American industrial capacity and buried that truth in classified files, while thousands of men died in battles headquarters knew could not be won. In Part 3, the kamikaze emerged as Japan's desperate response to overwhelming carrier superiority, killing thousands of American sailors, but failing to change the mathematics that had doomed Japan from the beginning. 17 Essex-class carriers at Leyte Gulf, 24 by war's end. 151 carriers of all types against Japan's 9. The ratio was 17-1, said. The mockery ended. The war ended. But the story has one final chapter. What happened to the men who built the carriers? What happened to the admirals who mocked them? What happened to the intelligence officers who tried to warn Japanese leadership and were silenced? And what is the real lesson of this story? The lesson that most historians miss. The lesson that explains not just how America won the Pacific War, but why Japan lost it before the first shot was fired. The answer is not what you expect. Henry Kaiser did not slow down when the war ended. The man who had revolutionized shipbuilding turned his attention to other industries. In 1945, he founded Kaiser Permanente, applying assembly line efficiency to healthcare delivery. The organization grew to become one of the largest healthcare providers in America, serving over 12 million patients today. Kaiser also entered automobile manufacturing, producing the Kaiser and Fraser car brands in the late 1940s. The venture eventually failed against established competitors, but Kaiser's willingness to challenge entire industries never wavered. He built steel mills in California when experts said West Coast steel production was impractical. He constructed the world's largest cement plant in Permanente, California. He developed residential communities in Hawaii that transformed island real estate. Kaiser died in 1967 at age 85, having accumulated a fortune estimated at over $400 million. His obituary in the New York Times called him the builder of the modern West. But Kaiser rarely spoke about his wartime shipbuilding achievements. When asked about the carriers that helped win the Pacific War, he deflected credit to his workers. "I didn't build those ships," he told an interviewer in 1958. 40,000 men and women built them. I just organized the assembly line. The modesty was genuine but incomplete. Kaiser had provided the vision that made mass carrier production possible. His workers had provided the labor. Together, they had achieved what Japanese intelligence believed was physically impossible. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita lived until 1977, 33 years after Leyte Gulf. He rarely discussed the battle publicly. When historians pressed him about his decision to withdraw, rather than press the attack against the escort carriers, Samar Kurita's explanations were carefully measured. He spoke of tactical considerations, fuel shortages, scattered formations, the difficulty of coordinating battleship operations against fast-moving carrier groups. What Kurita did not discuss publicly was his realization on October 24, 1944, that Japanese intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about American carrier strength. In private conversations late in life, Kurita was more direct. "When I saw the number of aircraft attacking my force, I understood that everything we had been told about enemy strength was false, not wrong by small margins, wrong by factors of 3 or 4. Pressing the attack would have destroyed my fleet without changing the outcome of the war." Kurita was never court-martialed for his withdrawal. Some officers believed he should have sacrificed his fleet for honor. Others understood that honor means nothing when the mathematics are absolute. But the Disan Tuksu kunyang ngui danong ne, không nam o quyết định cá nhân của họ. The legacy of Kaiser's shipbuilding revolution extended far beyond World War II. The prefabrication techniques he pioneered became standard practice in naval construction worldwide. Modern aircraft carriers, including the Gerald R. Ford class, currently serving in the U.S. Navy, are built using modular construction methods directly descended from Kaiser's innovations. Hull sections are fabricated in specialized facilities, then transported to the shipway for final assembly. Welding replaced riveting decades ago. The timeline from keel laying to commissioning has continued to shrink as techniques improve. But the impact extended beyond military applications. Kaiser's methods transformed civilian shipbuilding, bridge construction, and eventually manufacturing across dozens of industries. The concept of breaking complex projects into prefabricated modules built simultaneously in different locations became fundamental to modern industrial organization. Today we call it concurrent engineering or modular construction. Kaiser called it common sense. The Essex-class carriers themselves served for decades after the war. USS Essex remained in active service until 1969, participating in operations during the Korean War and early Vietnam War. USS Yorktown served until 1970 and became a museum ship at Patriots Point, South Carolina, where visitors can walk her decks today. USS Intrepid served until 1974 and now sits in New York Harbor as the centerpiece of the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum. Millions of visitors have toured these ships without knowing the story of how they were built in 14 months by workers who had never seen a warship before the war began. The carriers that Japanese admirals mocked as mass-produced inferior copies outlasted the Japanese Empire by decades. They carried American power across the Pacific during the Cold War. They launched aircraft over Korea and Vietnam. They demonstrated that mass production was not a weakness, but a strength. The ships were not elegant. They were not bespoke. They were built to win a war, and they won it. 24 Essex-class carriers were commissioned during World War II. 17 more were planned but cancelled when the war ended. If the conflict had continued into 1946, American carrier strength would have approached 50 fleet carriers. The Japanese intelligence assessment that projected American carrier strength would reach 130 vessels by mid-1945 was accurate. The production advantage was absolute and growing. No combination of tactical innovation, strategic adjustment, or pilot sacrifice could have changed the outcome. The deeper lesson of this story is not about shipbuilding or industrial capacity. It is about the failure of imagination that doomed Japan before the first carrier was laid down. Japanese naval officers were not stupid. They were not incompetent. Their intelligence collection was adequate. Their analysts were capable. They had access to information about American shipyard expansion carrier construction contracts and industrial mobilization that was publicly available in American newspapers and congressional records. The failure was not intelligence collection. It was interpretation. Japanese officers interpreted American industrial capacity through Japanese assumptions about what was possible. Japan built carriers as bespoke projects. Each ship was slightly different from the last. Each required custom solutions to unique problems. Construction took 3 to 4 years because precision craftsmanship demanded time. The idea that carriers could be mass-produced like automobiles violated everything Japanese naval culture believed about warship construction. So when evidence accumulated that Americans were building carriers faster than seemed possible, Japanese intelligence officers questioned the evidence rather than questioning their assumptions. Reconnaissance photographs showing multiple carriers at Pearl Harbor were dismissed as showing the same ships photographed at different times. Radio intercepts revealing unfamiliar call signs were attributed to deception measures. Prisoner testimonies describing carriers that did not appear in Japanese databases were explained as confusion or exaggeration. Every piece of evidence that contradicted institutional assumptions was rationalized away. The assumptions were protected. The evidence was filtered. The truth was buried. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The French assumed the Ardennes forest was impassable to tanks in 1940. The Americans assumed Pearl Harbor was too shallow for torpedo attacks in 1941. The Soviets assumed Nazi Germany would not invade before defeating Britain in 1941. In each case, institutional assumptions about what was possible prevented accurate assessment of what the enemy was actually doing. The failure of imagination is not unique to Japan. It is universal, and it remains the greatest threat to military effectiveness today. The final revelation of this story concerns the classified intelligence assessment completed in December 1944. The report that concluded American carrier strength exceeded 90 vessels and would approach 130 by mid-1945. The report that recommended immediate strategic reassessment at the highest levels of government. The report that was classified above top secret and restricted to 8 officers. That report was discovered in Japanese naval archives in 1978, 33 years after the war ended. Historians had known that Japanese intelligence underestimated American carrier production, but the December 1944 report proved something more disturbing. Japanese senior leadership had known the truth. They had seen the numbers. They had understood that the war was mathematically unwinnable, and they had continued operations anyway. The report was not lost or forgotten. It was deliberately suppressed. The 8 officers who saw it made a collective decision to continue fighting rather than acknowledge strategic defeat. That decision cost tens of thousands of lives in the final months of the war. Kamikaze pilots were sent on missions that senior leadership knew could not change the outcome. Surface forces were ordered into battles that headquarters knew could not be won. Submarines were dispatched to areas that commanders knew were saturated with American anti-submarine forces. Every operation from December 1944 to August 1945 was executed with senior leadership knowing privately that American industrial superiority made success impossible. The decision to continue fighting was not based on hope of victory. It was based on institutional inability to acknowledge defeat. Admitting the truth would have required explaining why the war had been started. It would have required accepting responsibility for catastrophic miscalculation. It would have required facing political and military consequences that no one in authority wanted to face. So the truth was buried. The war continued, and thousands died for institutional pride. The story of Japanese admirals mocking Essex carriers until 17 of them appeared at Leyte Gulf is not ultimately about carriers or shipbuilding or industrial capacity. It is about the human capacity for self-deception when truth becomes inconvenient. It is about institutions that protect assumptions rather than testing them. It is about leaders who choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Henry Kaiser saw shipbuilding as a manufacturing problem that could be solved through systematic analysis and continuous improvement. Japanese naval officers saw shipbuilding as a craft that could not be rushed or simplified. Both perspectives contained truth, but only one perspective proved adaptable when circumstances demanded change. The Americans were not smarter than the Japanese. They were not braver or more determined. They were more willing to question assumptions, test new methods, and scale solutions that worked. That willingness to adapt to experiment to treat impossibility as merely a problem not yet solved was the decisive advantage that won the Pacific War. From a 59-year-old civilian who had never built a warship to 17 fleet carriers at Leyte Gulf to 151 carriers by war's end. Henry Kaiser proved that the impossible was simply a problem no one had solved yet. And because he proved it, over 3,000 American pilots who would have died attacking defended targets from conventional distances instead survived to return home. The Essex-class carriers absorbed kamikaze hits that would have sunk lesser vessels and continued operations because their modular construction allowed rapid damage repair. The production lines that Japanese intelligence dismissed as incapable of sustained output produced carriers faster than Japan could produce pilots to attack them. The mathematics were absolute, the conclusion was inevitable, and the lesson endures. Never underestimate an opponent whose industrial philosophy treats impossibility as an engineering challenge. Never assume your constraints apply to enemies who think differently. Never protect assumptions when evidence demands revision. Japanese admirals mocked Essex carriers because mass production seemed incompatible with military excellence. They stopped mocking when 17 carriers appeared on the horizon and destroyed Japanese naval power in 3 days of sustained operations. The mockery ended. The fear began. And the war was decided not by courage or tactics or strategy, but by welding torches in American shipyards, by assembly lines that treated aircraft carriers like automobiles, by a civilian shipbuilder who asked, "Why not?" when everyone else said impossible. If you know another story of innovation that changed warfare, share it in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of impossible ideas that shaped World War II. Subscribe to discover more histories that deserve to be remembered. Because the past is full of lessons we keep forgetting, and forgetting is how wars are lost before they begin.